Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another study in the book of Judges. This week finds us in Judges chapter 6, verses 25 through 32. Last week we talked about the visitor that came and talked with Gideon, and we also learned the origin of that visitor. The messenger, actually, is what some translations say, but it was the angel of the Lord. And we also know that as soon as the angel of the Lord went up in the flame of the sacrifice that Gideon had made for the messenger, we understand that Gideon was afraid. And he was afraid because he was afraid he was going to die because he saw God face to face. And we discussed where that fear came from. And we also saw where the Lord told Gideon that he would not die. But we also learned where the Lord had a task for him to do. And that's exactly where our study finds us tonight. So let's start in verse 25, if you would please. Now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, "Take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut it down, the wooden image that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement. And take the second bull, and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image which you shall cut down." So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants, and did as the Lord had said to him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. Now I want to stop there a moment because notice the command from the Lord. The command was for Gideon to take down the Baal altar that was present on his father's property. Now, what's very interesting is why was this Baal mound on his father's property? Well, there are various ideas concerning this. One idea that I thought was very interesting is one that I read this morning as I was studying, was the fact that the father of Gideon could have also been a worshiper of Baal and Jehovah. And in fact, that was quite common according to what archaeologists have found in the Holy Land. And so the problem with that, though, is when you go to what God says on Mount Sinai, what the Ten Commandments say, what Mosaical law dictates, God says, "I am the Lord your God." He's a jealous God, and that they should serve him only. So let's say for the point of conjecture that Gideon's dad was an equal opportunity man when it came to worshiping of Baal and Jehovah. That is not right according to Mosaical law. His devotion should have been directed totally toward Jehovah and not to Baal. But yet other scholars seem to think that even though Gideon had a belief in God and he stayed within that belief, at some point Joash left the worship of God and he committed himself to the idolatrous practice of following Baal, to the point to where he allowed some of his property to be used to build a Baal mound and a reliquary for the Canaanite god and goddess Baal and Ashtaroth. Well, whatever the case is, and it really doesn't matter, we see here where God is going to make sure that he gets his point across, that he is God. There's only one. He is the great I am, as God declared to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. And God is going to empower and use his servant Gideon to make that fact well known. So let's look at the instruction. Gideon's home was that of an agrarian or agricultural society. So seeing these kind of Canaanite gods being worshipped in this capacity is not very surprising, because Baal was the weather god. Even though Baal was the top of the Canaanite pantheon, Baal was the weather god. Ashtaroth was the fertility god. And so there was no surprise that they chose these specific deities within the Canaanite pantheon, because they were an agrarian society. But notice that the command was to tear down the altar of Baal. Now notice what he says, that your father has. And that's what led into our discussion that we previously had on what exactly was Joash. Was he a priest of Baal, or was he just a sponsor that allowed the Baal mound to be on his property for the community? We really don't know, but as we will continue, and especially when we see Joash's challenge to the people that want to kill his son, that leads to even more interesting discussion on who exactly was Joash, the father of Gideon. Notice the command specifically. God not only told him what to do, but he also gave him instructions on how to do this. He was to take a bull of 7 years, and notice how there's an indicative here that implies there was more than one bull in the field. But God said, I want the young one of 7 years old, and I want you to take him to the Baal mound. Now, the bull was going to help him dismantle the Baal altar and tear down the Ashtoreth pole and so on and so forth. But then God continues with the instructions by telling Gideon, and also you're going to take the bull of 7 years old and you're going to sacrifice that bull to me by putting him on an altar that you will erect in my name. And we're going to get to that in a moment, what God meant when he said to build an altar. The best bull of Gideon's father's bulls was this of the young bull that God calls the young bull of 7 years old. Now, as I was studying for this last week, there was something in my mind. Well, how many bulls are we talking about? Did Gideon take 2 bulls to the mound, or did he take 1 bull to the mound? How many bulls were there? Well, the indicative here, and when we look at it from the Greek Septuagint, it's easier to understand, because the Greek Septuagint, which is the Old Testament in Koine Greek, shows us that what is implied is there were multiple bulls that Gideon's father owned, but it was the second one of 7 years old that God chose for Gideon to sacrifice. So this bull, as we talked about, would help tear down the pagan shrine, and then Gideon would sacrifice that bull. Some scholars believe there to be a specific reason why this bull was chosen. And I found this to be very interesting, and the reason why I wanted to share it with you tonight. It was because it was not only the best, but it symbolized God freeing his people from the Midianite oppression that had been going on for 7 years. And so notice what God is illustrating within the sacrificing of the bull on the new altar to Jehovah that would be erected on the same place that the Baal and the Ashtoreth pole was at. And the reason was God was telling the people, just as in the days of Elijah and that sacrifice that we see on Mount Carmel, it's the very same message. And that message is this: God is God. He is the only one. He is, in fact, the great I am. The altar that Gideon was instructed to construct was according to Mosaical law. Notice how in the New King James it says in the proper arrangement. And so what exactly does this mean? Well, let us turn to Exodus chapter 20 in verse 25. It is safe to say that Gideon could not use anything that made up of the Baal altar to make up God's altar. And this is the reason why. Notice in Mosaical law, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 25, it says, "And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it." So notice how what Gideon was supposed to do when building an altar unto the Lord was he was to use uncut stones, stones that had not been manipulated by human hands. Also notice with me in Deuteronomy 27, verses 5 and 6. In Deuteronomy 27, verses 5 and 6, we see once again the same rule repeated, but to another generation of Israelite. Notice what it says here, starting in verse 5. God says, "And there you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not use an iron tool on them. You shall build with whole stones the altar of the Lord your God, and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God." And so if that was the rule in Moses' day, and if that was the rule in the generation after the generation that exited out of Egypt, if that was the rule, then I am sure that was still the rule even in Gideon's day. And that's why in the scriptures it talks about by proper arrangement. So the location of where the altar of the Lord was given, and it was in the same location of where the Baal and the Asherah stood. Now, once again, we've talked about the significance of what that means. This was illustrating to the people that the dominance and supremacy of Jehovah. So I want you to think about your own life. And what are things in your life that you worship God and you have a heart to worship God, but sometimes some things come into your life that keep you from worshiping God to the best of your ability? Well, here's an application. Let us do our part to throw down the Baal altar of worldly entertainment and the Asherah pole of carnal pleasure in our lives. And when you think about what we witness on TV, what we see in movies, that's exactly what we're having to do. Because when we allow those things to have a place in our heart, that is not allowing us to give God the high place of our heart. And so let us give God the high place of our heart. Let us put away the Asherah pole of the pleasures of the earth that the Apostle John warns us about. Let us do what we can do to be like Gideon and totally sanctify, separate our hearts. That's what that means. Separate our hearts from the vain things of this world. Well, unfortunately, as we see in the instruction, nothing was wrong with the instruction, but what is wrong is Gideon's attitude. We see where Gideon was told to get this done, but notice he's hesitant. And why is he hesitant? Because he feared his father's household. Now, some say, well, he still got it done, even though it was at night. But it was in the context of which he got it done, the context of which he obeyed. And that was his motivation for not getting it done right as the Lord God commanded, was because he feared his father's household. Well, let's go to Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, because let us not put the hammer of judgment solely on Gideon before we put that same hammer on ourselves. How many times have we had the opportunity to share the gospel of Jesus Christ and we didn't do it because of fear of what somebody might think, because of fear of something coming to HR and us being reprimanded at work, the fear of being fired for sharing our faith? Let us go to Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28. How would Jesus calm down Gideon? How would Jesus calm down us in this kind of fear? Notice what it says. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. It also brings up Luke chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, doesn't it? I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has power to cast into hell. Yes, I say to you, fear him. So the application that we come to at this juncture of our study is, let us not fear the repercussions of man, but let us be obedient to the Lord, who controls the eternal repercussions of those who are in disobedience to him. And so when it comes to standing up for God, let us not wait for where there's nobody around, but let us be that shining light. Let us be that salt of the earth that Christ commands us to be in the Beatitudes. Well, let us turn back to the book of Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. And let's continue in our reading together. Starting in verse 28. Gideon completes what has been commanded of him to do at night. Now, let's fast forward the clock to the next morning. Notice verse 28. And when the men of the city arose early in the morning, there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image that was beside it was cut down, and the second bull was being offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, who has done this thing? And when they had inquired and asked, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. Then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die, because he has torn down the altar of Baal, and because he has cut down the wooden image that was beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down. Therefore, on that day, he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him, because he has torn down his altar. Well, as we continue in our discussion, we see that the people notice that the sight of the pagan objects of worship being destroyed. And what they see is the sight of obeisance to Jehovah taking place on the altar built to him. And so instead of fully realizing what is going on, this should have put people on their knees. But instead, this was their reaction. Who has done this thing? And when they inquired and asked, and they learned that it was Gideon, notice what they wanted to do to him. Bring out your son, that he may die, because he has torn down the altar of Baal, and because he has cut down the wooden image that was beside it. Judges chapter 6, verses 29 and 30. The thing that should have put them on their knees in praise and repentance toward God, they didn't get the message, didn't they? They didn't understand what was being taught by the Lord God there on that mound that used to be a place where Baal was worshipped. They didn't understand. But notice Joash. Joash does what any father would do that loves his son. He protected his son. Now, the way that he protects his son is very interesting. And I believe this is the reason why some scholars believe that Joash also worshiped Jehovah as well as Baal. It's still wrong, but I believe this is why some scholars believe this. But notice how the men of the city brought out the father of Gideon and demanded Gideon's life. But I've often wondered, instead of thinking like the scholars saying, well, Joash was an equal opportunity religious man, which I don't really believe that. I want to believe this. I believe that when Joash saw what Gideon had done, and especially when he saw what was built in the place of the Baal and the Asherah, and especially when he saw that young bull being sacrificed upon the remains of the Asherah pole on fire, I believe that Joash understood what was taking place. And the reason why I believe he understood this is because he asked a fundamental question. Would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down. So notice what he's telling the people. He's telling the people that if this thing of stone and wood, if it's truly a god, then let the gods avenge themselves. You see, Joash was coming to the realization that the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth was empty. And it was something that his son was demonstrating hold no power or sway over anything that took place in that agrarian society. This brings in Isaiah 44, verses 9 through 20, and I would encourage you to turn there whenever you have some time, because it describes for us the futility of idol worship. And you'll really enjoy that, and you will see why the gears were starting to turn for Joash, the father of Gideon. I want to thank you for joining me tonight as we studied from Judges chapter 6. We're going to continue our study next time, starting in verse 33, because we're going to talk about a fleece, Gideon's needing proof again. So I hope you will join us for next time. And until we meet again, I bid you all a very pleasant good evening.